In the early years of the Second World War, when Europe was still wrapped in fear and uncertainty, Britain faced a problem that could not be solved with courage alone. Across the English Channel, the coast of occupied France had been turned into a fortress. Concrete bunkers stared out at the sea like unblinking eyes. Steel obstacles waited beneath the waves, ready to tear open landing craft. Mines slept quietly under sand, prepared to wake at the lightest step. Any future invasion would not begin with heroism, but with survival. And survival, at that moment, seemed unlikely. British military planners knew that one day, an invasion would be necessary. That invasion would later become known as D-Day, but in 1943 it was still just a terrifying idea discussed in quiet rooms. The question was simple but frightening. How do you get soldiers across a beach that is designed to kill them before they even arrive? Bombing the coast from the air did little. Concrete bunkers absorbed explosions like stone giants. Naval guns could hit the shoreline, but accuracy was poor, and smoke quickly hid targets. Engineers could not clear obstacles while being fired upon. Every solution seemed to demand lives as payment. Too many lives. So Britain did what it often did in moments of desperation. It turned to invention. This was a strange period of the war, when logic sometimes stepped aside for urgency. Engineers were encouraged to think freely, wildly, even foolishly. If an idea might save lives, it was worth considering, no matter how unusual it sounded. This thinking gave birth to floating tanks, explosive boats, remote-controlled vehicles, and weapons that looked more like toys than tools of war. Somewhere in this atmosphere of creative panic, a question was asked. What if a bomb didn't need a soldier to carry it? What if it didn't need an engine? What if it didn't even need steering? What if it could simply roll forward, driven by nothing but momentum, and smash itself into the enemy's defenses? The answer to that question would become one of the most bizarre weapons ever imagined. The device had no elegant shape. It was not sleek or aerodynamic. It was not clever in the modern sense. It was brutal, simple, and almost childlike. Two enormous wooden wheels, each taller than a man. Between them, a large drum packed with high explosives. No cockpit. No controls. No guidance system. The idea was that rockets attached to the rims of the wheels would spin it forward at incredible speed. Once released, it would race across the beach, slam into concrete defenses, and explode with enough force to tear them apart. It sounded simple. Almost too simple. Someone, perhaps jokingly, gave it a name. They called it the Great Panjandrum. In English humor, a panjandrum is someone who appears very important but is actually quite useless. The name was meant as a laugh, something temporary. But the name stayed, and soon it was written into official documents, blueprints, and test schedules. At this stage, the Great Panjandrum existed only in theory. On paper, it promised a miracle. A way to clear beaches without risking soldiers. A way to break concrete walls without sending men into gunfire. In meeting rooms, it looked bold. On diagrams, it looked unstoppable. But war has a way of punishing ideas that ignore reality. Engineers began building the first prototype. It was enormous, awkward, and unsettling to look at. The wheels were made of wood, reinforced with metal rims. Dozens of cordite rockets were attached around the circumference. The explosive drum in the center was heavy enough to make even experienced engineers nervous. There were quiet concerns, whispered doubts. What if the rockets didn't fire evenly? What if one side burned faster than the other? What if the wheels didn't stay straight? Those questions were pushed aside. There was no time for fear. The invasion was coming. Solutions were needed now. And so, with cautious optimism and a growing sense of unease, the Great Panjandrum was taken to a beach for testing. No one there truly understood what they were about to witness. The sea was calm. The sand stretched wide and empty. Observers stood at what they believed was a safe distance. Cameras were set up. Notes were prepared. This was meant to be a proud moment, a step toward saving thousands of lives. The rockets were ignited. At first, the Panjandrum moved as planned. The wheels spun. Sand flew into the air. The massive device began rolling forward, faster and faster, exactly as the designers had hoped. For a brief moment, It looked like success. Then something went wrong. One rocket burned slightly faster than the others. Just slightly. But with a machine this large, even a small imbalance became a disaster. The panjandrum began to wobble. Then it veered. Then it shook violently, like an animal trying to break free of its restraints. Rockets tore loose from the wheels and flew wildly in every direction. Some shot backward toward the spectators. Others skipped across the sand like fire-breathing stones. The great rolling weapon turned suddenly, charging not toward an imaginary enemy, but toward the people who had built it. Observers ran. Engineers scattered. Military officers dove for cover. Cameras shook as their operators fled. The panjandrum, now completely out of control, spun, bounced, and finally collapsed in a storm of smoke, fire, and confusion. Miraculously, no one was killed. But the message was clear. The great panjandrum was not a weapon. It was a warning. And yet, the story did not end there. The first test should have ended the idea. Any reasonable project would have been cancelled immediately, its remains quietly buried in paperwork and embarrassment. But the war did not reward reason. It rewarded persistence, and sometimes stubbornness dressed up as hope. After the beach was cleared and the smoke drifted away, the great panjandrum was dragged back into discussion rooms, not as a failure, but as a machine that simply needed improvement. The men in charge convinced themselves that the problem was not the idea, only the execution. The imbalance, they said, could be fixed. The rockets could be improved. The wheels could be reinforced. Control cables could be added. Each flaw became a challenge instead of a warning. And in wartime Britain, challenges were rarely refused. Behind the scenes, preparations for what would later be known as Operation Overlord were accelerating. Maps were being redrawn daily. Timetables changed with the weather. Every weapon that might help clear a beach was reconsidered, no matter how strange. In that atmosphere, the panjandrum survived. Engineers returned to the design with nervous energy. More rockets were added, not fewer. Stronger cords. Thicker wheels. The explosive payload was increased, because if it was going to hit something, it needed to destroy it completely. Safety margins were discussed, then quietly ignored. There was always a sense that the device was alive, waiting for its next chance to escape. This time, the test would be more controlled. Or at least, that was the plan. The beach was cleared even further. Observers were moved back. Cables were attached to the panjandrum, long ropes intended to guide it and restrain it if things went wrong. In theory, these cables would keep the machine running straight. In theory, they would save lives. When the rockets ignited again, the sound was deeper, angrier. The panjandrum surged forward with terrifying speed, faster than before, carving deep grooves into the sand. For a few seconds, the cables held. The weapon stayed mostly straight. Notes were taken. Hope flickered. Then the cables snapped. One by one, they tore loose under the strain. Freed from restraint, the panjandrum did what it seemed to enjoy most. It rebelled. It began to swerve wildly, the massive wheels lifting slightly off the ground as rockets detached and spun into the air. The central drum shook violently, threatening to tear itself apart. The machine turned, slowed, then lurched again, racing unpredictably across the beach like a drunken giant. Observers ran again. This time faster. The panjandrum did not explode. Instead, it collapsed into a chaotic heap of wood, metal, and smoking rocket casings. Once more, luck spared everyone nearby. Once more, silence followed the noise. And still, the project was not cancelled. There was a strange psychology at work now. Too much effort had been spent. Too many hours invested. Too many signatures already on the approval papers. Admitting failure felt harder than continuing. The panjandrum was becoming less a weapon and more a symbol of refusal to give up. A third version was ordered. This one would be the largest yet. More rockets. Even bigger wheels. Reinforced construction. The hope was that sheer power would overpower instability. That momentum would replace control. It was a dangerous belief, but it was sincerely held. By now, whispers had spread through the ranks. Some sailors joked about it. Some engineers avoided standing too close. A few officers openly doubted it would ever be used in combat. But wartime Britain had room for doubt only if there was also time. And time was something they believed they did not have. The final tests were almost surreal. Military photographers were present. Senior officers watched from what they believed was a safe distance. There was an air of forced confidence, as if everyone agreed not to imagine what might happen if things went wrong again. When the rockets fired, the Panjandrum launched forward with astonishing force. Faster than ever before. Sand erupted behind it in thick clouds. For a brief, impossible moment, it looked magnificent, like a mechanical beast charging into battle. Then it veered. The rockets misfired unevenly. One wheel accelerated faster than the other. The Panjandrum turned sharply, racing not toward imaginary enemy defenses, but directly toward the watching officers. Panic exploded across the beach. Men scattered in every direction. Some threw themselves flat into the sand. Others ran without looking back. Rockets flew loose, skidding and spinning like angry insects. Smoke swallowed the shoreline. Cameras shook violently as their operators fled. The great Panjandrum, now fully unchained, rolled and bounced until it finally smashed itself apart. This time, there was no applause. No discussion of improvements. No quiet optimism. Only relief that no one had died. The message could no longer be ignored. The Panjandrum was not unreliable because of small flaws. It was unreliable because it was uncontrollable by nature. A weapon that could not be aimed, stopped, or predicted had no place on a real battlefield. And so, quietly, without ceremony, the great Panjandrum was abandoned. No official announcement. No dramatic cancellation. Just silence. But the beaches of Normandy would soon see invasion anyway. Not with rolling bombs, but with tanks, engineers, courage, and terrible sacrifice. The Panjandrum faded into obscurity, remembered only by those who had seen it run wild across the sand. In the next part, the story turns reflective and almost gentle as we explore what the great Panjandrum teaches us about war, desperation, and the strange line between genius and madness. After the final test, there was no meeting where someone stood up and declared the great Panjandrum dead. That is not how failures usually end in wartime. Instead, the weapon simply stopped being mentioned. Reports were filed away. Test footage was labeled and stored. Engineers were reassigned to other projects. The Panjandrum did not receive a funeral or an apology. It was erased quietly, as if ignoring it might undo the embarrassment it had caused. Yet among those who had seen it in motion, the memory refused to fade. Some remembered the sound first. The roar of dozens of rockets igniting at once, not like artillery or engines, but like something tearing itself apart. Others remembered the way the ground shook as the wheels spun, or the moment when excitement turned into fear, when everyone realized the machine had no intention of obeying the people who built it. What made the Panjandrum unsettling was not just that it failed, but that it failed in such a dramatic, almost intentional way. It did not simply stop working. It rebelled. It turned. It charged in the wrong direction. It scattered fire and metal across the beach like a tantrum. It felt less like a broken tool and more like a warning about what happens when desperation replaces judgment. For a while, some officers tried to defend it in conversation. They argued that many experimental weapons fail before success is found. They pointed to other projects that had once seemed impossible. But even they spoke softly, without conviction. Deep down, everyone understood that the Panjandrum was different. It wasn't an unfinished solution. It was a dead end. Meanwhile, preparations for the invasion continued without it. Engineers focused on practical tools. Specialized tanks that could clear mines. Vehicles that could lay bridges across obstacles. Flamethrowers to clear bunkers. Simple, brutal, reliable machines operated by trained soldiers. None of these inventions were elegant, but they had one advantage the Panjandrum never did. They could be controlled. As the invasion drew closer, there was no time left for fantasies. Beaches would be taken meter by meter, at terrible cost. No rolling miracle would clear the way. No runaway machine would save lives without risking others. And yet, even in its failure, the Panjandrum left something behind. It exposed the mindset of a nation under pressure. Britain, cornered and threatened, had reached a point where even the most absurd ideas were allowed to breathe. The panjandrum was not created by fools. It was created by intelligent people working under impossible expectations. They were asked to solve an unsolvable problem quickly, cheaply, and safely. The result was a machine that reflected the chaos of the moment it was born in. Some engineers later admitted they had doubts from the beginning. Others said they believed it might work until they saw it move. A few even confessed that watching it fail was strangely relieving. It meant they could finally stop pretending. Years later, when the war was over and documents were declassified, the Great Panjandrum reappeared in stories and photographs. People laughed at it. Historians shook their heads. It became a symbol of wartime madness, a favorite example in books about failed weapons. But those reactions came from a place of safety. At the time, laughter was not part of the experience. Standing on that beach, watching a massive explosive device roll unpredictably toward you, was not funny. It was terrifying. It reminded everyone present that technology, when rushed and uncontrolled, can become as dangerous to its creators as to its enemies. The panjandrum never reached enemy shores. It never destroyed a bunker. It never fired a shot in anger. And yet, in its own strange way, it served a purpose. It showed the limits of invention. It forced planners to confront reality. It quietly pushed them back toward solutions that relied on coordination, training, and human judgment rather than blind momentum. As the invasion finally came, and beaches were stormed under fire, the absence of the panjandrum went unnoticed. No one wished it were there. No one asked what might have happened if it had been finished. Its story had already reached its natural conclusion. Still, long after the echoes of battle faded, the image remained. Two massive wheels. A drum of explosives. Rockets firing in all directions. A weapon that could not be commanded. In the next part, the story slows even further, stepping away from tests and explosions, and looking at how the Great Panjandrum survives today. Not as a weapon, but as a memory, a lesson, and a quiet reminder of how thin the line can be between innovation and disaster. After the war ended and the world slowly learned how to breathe again, many weapons disappeared into storage, scrapyards, or museums. Some were celebrated. Some were studied. Others were quietly forgotten. The Great Panjandrum belonged to the last group. It did not fit the story people wanted to tell about victory, courage, and clever strategy. It was awkward, uncontrollable, and deeply uncomfortable to explain. For years, it lived only in filing cabinets and fading memories. Engineers who had worked on it returned to civilian life. Some designed bridges. Some taught at universities. Some never spoke about wartime experiments again. When asked about strange projects from the war, a few would smile politely and change the subject. The panjandrum was not something they were proud of, but it was not something they regretted either. It was simply something that had happened. As documents were slowly declassified, fragments of the story resurfaced. Grainy photographs showed the massive wheels half buried in sand. Old film reels revealed the moment when the machine lurched sideways and chaos erupted. To modern eyes, it looked almost comedic, like something built without fear of consequence. But the people who watched it run did not see comedy. They saw how thin the margin was between control and disaster. They saw how easily confidence could turn into panic. They saw how a machine designed to save lives could just as easily take them. In quiet ways, the Great Panjandrum began to change how people thought about innovation in war. It became a cautionary tale passed between engineers and planners. Not always by name, but by lesson. The lesson was simple. Power without control is not strength. Speed without direction is not progress. And invention without restraint can become its own enemy. The panjandrum showed that complexity is not the same as intelligence. Adding more rockets did not make it better. Making it larger did not make it safer. Each attempt to overpower its flaws only magnified them. What it needed was understanding, not force. And understanding was something no one had time to develop. In later conflicts, experimental weapons still appeared, but testing became stricter. Safety zones grew larger. Remote controls replaced human proximity. Failures were expected, but chaos was not accepted. In this way, the Panjandrum contributed indirectly to future discipline, even though it never contributed directly to battle. There is something deeply human about the story. Faced with fear, people reach for bold answers. When those answers fail, they try again, louder and harder. Admitting that an idea is wrong can feel more painful than risking one more attempt. The Panjandrum existed because no one wanted to be the first to say stop. And yet, someone eventually did. Not with a speech. Not with an order. Just by letting it fade. Today, the Great Panjandrum survives mostly as a story told late at night, in documentaries, podcasts, and quiet conversations about the war's stranger corners. It fits perfectly into that space where history becomes almost unreal, where listeners half wonder if it was exaggerated or misunderstood. But the evidence remains. The photographs. The reports. The film. It really existed. And maybe that is why it continues to fascinate. Not because it was powerful, but because it was vulnerable. It showed that even in a highly organized military system, confusion can take the shape of wood, metal, and fire. It showed that intelligence does not guarantee wisdom. It showed that fear can push creativity into dangerous places. The Panjandrum reminds us that war is not only fought with guns and tanks. It is also fought in minds under pressure, where ideas race faster than caution, and where hope can briefly disguise risk. As the years pass, fewer people remember the war firsthand. What remains are stories. Some are heroic. Some are tragic. And some, like this one, are strange and unsettling, refusing to fit neatly into categories. In the final part, the story will come to rest. Not with explosions or failure, but with reflection. With the quiet understanding of why the Great Panjandrum still matters, long after its wheels stopped turning and the beach fell silent. With time, the story of the Great Panjandrum settles into something quieter. The noise fades first. The roar of rockets, the shouting on the beach, the sudden panic as men ran for safety, all of that slowly dissolves into silence. What remains is not the machine itself, but the feeling it left behind. A feeling that something had gone too far, too fast. The Panjandrum no longer exists as wood and metal. It exists as an idea frozen in history. A moment when invention outran understanding. When urgency drowned out restraint. When people believed that enough force could replace control. It is easy, now, to look back and laugh. To call it absurd. To share it as a strange anecdote from a strange war. But doing that misses the deeper truth. The Panjandrum was not built because people were foolish. It was built because people were afraid. Afraid of failure. Afraid of delay. Afraid of the cost that waiting might bring. In that fear, the machine made sense. Just enough sense to move forward. Just enough sense to be tested. Just enough sense to survive one failure, and then another. Until finally, reality spoke louder than optimism. What the Panjandrum teaches, quietly and patiently, is that war does not only destroy cities and lives. It distorts thinking. It compresses time. It convinces intelligent people that extreme solutions are reasonable simply because the problem feels unbearable. Under that pressure, boundaries blur. Risks are redefined. And sometimes, mistakes are built large enough to roll. There is something almost peaceful about knowing how the story ends. Not with an explosion in combat. Not with lives lost on a foreign shore. But with a decision to stop. To let an idea go. To accept that not every problem can be solved by force or speed. The beaches where the Panjandrum once ran wild are quiet now. Waves move in slow, steady rhythms. The sand no longer remembers the tracks of giant wheels or the scorch marks of rockets. Nature has erased the evidence, as it always does. Only history keeps the memory alive. And perhaps that is where the Great Panjandrum belongs. Not as a joke. Not as a failure to mock. But as a reminder. A reminder that invention needs patience. That power needs guidance. That some ideas, no matter how bold, must be questioned before they are unleashed. In a war defined by destruction, the Panjandrum stands out because it never fulfilled its purpose. It never harmed an enemy. It never shaped a battle. Instead, it shaped a lesson. A quiet one. Easy to miss, but still relevant. Even today, when technology moves faster than ever, when new ideas promise quick solutions to complex problems, the shadow of the Panjandrum lingers. It whispers a warning from the past. Slow down. Test carefully. Understand what you are building before you let it run free. And so the story ends not with fire, but with reflection. The great Panjandrum, a weapon that never went to war, becomes something more lasting than any explosion. It becomes a story we tell in calm voices, late at night, not to shock, but to remind. Sometimes, the most important victories are the ideas we choose not to use. This is another concept. This is another story. And if you truly listen to it, not just hear it, it may shock you. Because this is not a story about a machine that failed in battle. This is a story about a machine that failed before reality even allowed it to exist. And yet, it almost did. Every war creates weapons. But some wars create obsessions. In the later years of the Second World War, as Germany began to feel the weight of resistance, bombing, and loss, something strange happened inside its military planning rooms. The ideas became larger, louder, heavier, not smarter, just bigger. And somewhere inside that pressure, someone asked a dangerous question. What if a tank didn't need to hide? What if it didn't need speed? What if it didn't need roads, or bridges, or permission from physics? What if it was so large that nothing on Earth could stop it? Pause for a moment. Let that idea sit. Because that question led to a concept so extreme, so unrealistic, that even today historians pause when describing it. The machine was called Landkreuzer P.1000 Rat. And no, the name is not ironic. It means rat. A rat that weighed 1,000 tons. Let that sink in. Most tanks of the era weighed around 30 tons. Heavy tanks may be 50 or 60. This one was planned to weigh 1,000. At this moment in the story, you might already feel the twist coming. Because nothing that heavy moves easily. Nothing that heavy hides. Nothing that heavy survives modern war. And yet, the idea moved forward. The plan was almost laughable, if it wasn't so serious. The rat would be longer than a football field. Taller than a house. Wide enough to crush buildings simply by turning. Its main gun was not even a tank gun. It was a naval battleship cannon. The kind normally mounted on warships. The kind designed to fire shells weighing more than a car. The kind meant to destroy cities from kilometers away. Now here is the first real twist. The designers knew it was impossible. They knew it couldn't cross bridges. They knew it couldn't be transported by rail. They knew it would consume fuel faster than entire armored divisions. And yet, they continued. Why? Because by this stage of the war, logic was no longer the strongest force in the room. Fear was. Germany was losing air superiority. Bombers were crossing the sky uncontested. Factories were burning. Supply lines were breaking. And when systems begin to collapse, people don't always look for balance. They look for miracles. The rat was not a weapon. It was a miracle fantasy made of steel. Another twist. Even if the rat could move, which itself was doubtful, it would be visible from the sky from miles away. A single Allied bomber squadron would see it like a beacon. It would become the largest target in Europe. And still, no one stopped the project. Think about that. Engineers were calculating how many engines it would need. 6, 8, even more. Naval engines. Submarine engines. Anything powerful enough. Each calculation made it worse. Cooling systems became impossible. Fuel storage became absurd. Crew size reached dozens, not soldiers, but operators, mechanics, engineers, gunners, coordinators. This was no longer a tank. It was a moving city. And cities do not survive modern warfare. Here comes another hook. The ground itself could not support it. The soil would collapse beneath its weight. Roads would crumble. Fields would turn to mud. It would sink, under its own ambition. And yet, plans were drawn. Sketches approved. Meetings held. Because when ego enters engineering, reality becomes optional. One German official reportedly loved the idea because it represented power. Not usefulness. Not efficiency. Just dominance. A psychological weapon. Something that would terrify enemies simply by existing. But war does not reward intimidation alone. War rewards logistics. And logistics were the rat's executioner. To supply one rat, entire fuel convoys would be required. To protect it, air cover that Germany no longer had. To repair it, factories that were already under bombardment. The machine would drain resources faster than it could destroy anything. Here is the quietest twist of all. The rat never needed to be destroyed. Reality killed it. No enemy shell. No bomb. No battlefield. Just arithmetic. At some point, even the most loyal planners could not ignore the numbers. The project was quietly dropped. No announcement. No dramatic cancellation. Just silence. The rat died the way many dangerous ideas die. Not with fire, but with embarrassment. And yet, and this is important, the story does not end here. Because the Landkreuzer rat represents something larger than itself. It represents what happens when power becomes symbolic instead of practical. When leaders chase dominance instead of survival. When size replaces strategy. And this pattern did not end with World War II. You see it again and again in history. Weapons too large to deploy. Systems too complex to maintain. Machines built to impress, not to function. The rat never rolled. Never fired. Never crushed a building. But it crushed something else. The illusion that bigger always means stronger. And if you slow this story down, if you let the silence between these ideas breathe, you realize something unsettling. The most dangerous machines are not the ones that explode. They are the ones that convince people they don't need limits. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because once the idea of the Landkreuzer began to exist, it stopped being a joke. It entered offices. It entered meetings. It entered serious conversations between men who were deciding the future of a collapsing war. And the most dangerous moment for any impossible idea is the moment it is taken seriously. The Landkreuzer P.1000 rat was not born in a factory. It was born on paper. Long sheets of drawings. Measurements that kept growing. Numbers that no one wanted to reduce. Every line on those blueprints pushed further away from reality, but closer to obsession. Here is the first twist you may not expect. No one asked whether it could survive in battle. They only asked whether it could be built. That difference matters. Engineers began calculating armor thickness. If it was going to be this large, it had to be nearly invulnerable. So they planned armor thicker than anything previously used on land. Thick enough to resist anti-tank guns. Thick enough to shrug off artillery. Thick enough to make crews feel untouchable. But with every added layer of armor, the weight exploded. And with weight came new problems. The engines required to move it were not tank engines. They were naval engines. Engines designed for submarines and ships. Huge, loud, fuel-hungry machines that produced heat on a terrifying scale. Cooling them inside a moving steel fortress bordered on impossible. Another twist. The rat would not be able to turn easily. It would not be able to retreat quickly. It would not be able to hide. Once committed to a direction, it would move forward slowly, like fate itself. And if the battlefield changed, if air power appeared, if terrain shifted, it would be trapped inside its own size. The crew size kept growing. Not 5 men. Not 10. But dozens. Gunners. Loaders. Mechanics. Engineers. Officers. Communications staff. Anti-aircraft crews. Each one dependent on the others. Each one sealed inside a machine that could become their tomb if disabled. Pause here. Imagine being inside it. The noise alone would be unbearable. Engines roaring constantly. Steel vibrating. Heat rising. The smell of fuel and oil trapped in enclosed corridors. And above all, the knowledge that if the machine stopped, there was no escape. Another hook. The main gun was so large that firing it would affect the vehicle's balance. Recoil forces would travel through the entire structure. Engineers worried it might damage its own suspension. So they reinforced it. And reinforcement meant more weight. Always more weight. At some point, the Rat stopped resembling a tank and started resembling a land battleship. A moving fortress designed for a kind of warfare that no longer existed. By this stage of the war, speed mattered. Flexibility mattered. Air superiority mattered. The Rat offered none of these. It was a monument to an earlier way of thinking, when armor and guns alone decided victory. And yet, support for the idea remained. Why? Because psychologically, it felt powerful. The Rat promised certainty in an uncertain war. It promised dominance when dominance was slipping away. It promised something visible, something dramatic, something that could restore confidence inside a leadership increasingly surrounded by bad news. Here comes another quiet twist. The enemy did not need to destroy the Rat. They only needed to wait. A machine that large requires constant maintenance, constant fuel, constant protection. Every kilometer traveled would be a logistical event. Every repair would take days. Every breakdown would be catastrophic. And breakdowns were guaranteed. Tracks would wear out under immense pressure. Engines would overheat. Gear systems would fail. The ground beneath it would crack. Bridges would collapse before it even reached them. In one calculation, engineers realized it could not cross most rivers in Europe. Not because of enemy action, but because no bridge could hold it. So how would it reach the front? It wouldn't. Another hook. The Rat could only exist where it was built. And wherever it was built would become a target. Allied bombers would not need intelligence reports. They would not need spies. A factory capable of assembling such a machine would be massive. Impossible to hide. Impossible to defend. The Rat would invite destruction before it ever moved. Slowly, resistance grew. Not loud resistance. Not open arguments. But quiet reluctance. Delays. Recalculations. Endless requests for revisions. Engineers asking for time. Officers postponing decisions. This is how impossible projects die. Not with refusal, but with delay. And finally, the numbers became impossible to ignore. Fuel consumption alone rivaled that of entire divisions. Steel requirements conflicted with critical shortages. Engine demands clashed with submarine production. Every resource assigned to the Rat weakened something else. At last, the fantasy collapsed under its own scale. The Landkreuzer was never cancelled with drama. It was simply left behind as priorities shifted. Air defense. Real tanks. Repairing damage. Holding ground. The Rat faded back into sketches and what-ifs. But here is the final twist of this part. Even though it was never built, it still tells us exactly how desperate the situation had become. When a nation begins planning machines that defy terrain, logistics, and physics, it is no longer planning for victory. It is planning for symbolism. And in war, symbolism is heavy. Too heavy to move. This is where the story turns dark. Not loud dark. Not explosive dark. But slow, heavy, suffocating dark, the kind that presses down on the mind until bad ideas start to feel necessary. By the time the Landkreuzer P.1000 Rat was being discussed seriously, Germany was no longer fighting a confident war. It was fighting a shrinking one. A war where maps became smaller, where arrows no longer pointed forward, but inward. A war where every report began with losses and ended with excuses. And inside that pressure, something dangerous happened. Reality stopped being trusted. When air raids destroyed factories, the answer was not better defense, it was bigger weapons. When tanks were destroyed faster than they could be replaced, the answer was not flexibility, it was invulnerability. When strategy failed, the answer was not reflection, it was escalation. The rat fit perfectly into this mindset. It was not designed to win battles. It was designed to deny weakness. Here is the first dark truth. The rat was never meant to move often. It was meant to exist. Just its presence was supposed to change the war. A land fortress that could sit on the front like a threat carved into the earth. Something that told both enemies and allies that Germany was still capable of creating the unimaginable. But war does not care about intimidation. War cares about function. Another twist. Inside leadership circles, there was a growing belief that conventional warfare had failed them. Tanks were destroyed by aircraft. Infantry was worn down by artillery. Supply lines were broken daily. So instead of fixing weaknesses, the imagination escaped upward, toward machines so extreme they felt untouchable. This is not innovation. This is denial with blueprints. The darker you look, the clearer it becomes. The rat was not about engineering. It was about psychology. It allowed planners to avoid confronting reality. As long as the rat existed on paper, hope could exist in meetings. As long as sketches were being refined, defeat could be postponed emotionally. Another hook. The bigger the machine became, the smaller the conversation about human cost grew. No one talked about evacuation if it was disabled. No one talked about what happened if it caught fire. No one talked about what dozens of men would experience trapped inside a burning steel structure the size of a building. Because to think about that would be to admit fear. And fear was not allowed. The crew would not be soldiers in the traditional sense. They would be caretakers of a monster. Maintaining engines hotter than anything used on land. Feeding fuel into systems that could not rest. Listening constantly for signs of failure, knowing that a single breakdown could turn the entire machine into a stationary coffin. Pause here. Imagine the silence after engine shutdown. Not relief, dread. Because restarting would take time. And time, in war, is when bombs arrive. Another twist. Even if the rat had reached combat, it would have been surrounded. Aircraft would circle endlessly. Artillery would range it like a landmark. Sabotage teams would target supply lines. The machine itself would not need to be destroyed, only isolated. A weapon that cannot retreat becomes a liability. And the rat could not retreat. The ground beneath it would be permanently damaged. Roads destroyed by its passage. Bridges unusable. It would leave scars behind it, marking its own path for the enemy to follow. This is where the darkness deepens. The rat demanded faith. Faith in size. Faith in power. Faith that the world would bend around it. But the world does not bend. It breaks those who demand it. At some point, even the most devoted supporters sensed it. Not openly. Not publicly. But in hesitation. In slowed approvals. In quiet redirection of resources. The project did not end because someone shouted stop. It ended because everyone slowly stopped believing. And belief was the only thing holding it together. The rat never reached steel. Never reached fire. Never reached motion. It died as an idea. But ideas can be more dangerous than machines. Because the same thinking that created the rat created other disasters. Projects rushed into service. Weapons deployed before tested. Soldiers sent into battle with machines not ready to protect them. The rat is only famous because it never reached that stage. Another unsettling thought. Had the war lasted longer? Had desperation deepened? The rat might have been built anyway. Not because it made sense, but because hopelessness demands spectacle. This is the darkest part of the story. The Landkreuzer rat shows us that collapse does not always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like ambition. Sometimes it looks like grand plans. Sometimes it looks like confidence that grows louder as reality grows quieter. And when systems fail, they do not always shrink. They swell. They grow monstrous. They imagine solutions so large that no one dares question them. The rat stands as a silent warning from that moment. A reminder that when fear replaces strategy, even the smartest people can design disasters and call them hope. In the next part, the story will sink even deeper into comparison, legacy, and how this obsession with impossible machines appears again and again whenever power begins to slip, not just in war, but in history itself. By the time the Landkreuzer P.1000 rat reached this stage in the imagination, it was no longer just a design. It had become a belief. And beliefs are far more dangerous than machines, because they do not need fuel, or steel, or logic to survive. They only need fear. Inside underground rooms, far from the sound of bombs, conversations continued. Not about retreat. Not about surrender. But about scale. About presence. About how something enormous might reverse something collapsing. The rat fit perfectly into that mental space. It allowed leaders to think upward instead of inward. To escape the narrowing reality by expanding the fantasy. Here is a quiet twist that often goes unnoticed. The rat was never meant to fight alongside other tanks. It would have stood alone. That aloneness mattered. It reflected how isolated decision-making had become. How disconnected plans were from soldiers, terrain, and time. The rat did not belong to an army. It belonged to an idea of power that no longer required cooperation. And war punishes isolation. Another dark layer emerges when you compare it to what was actually working. Smaller, simpler machines were surviving longer. Flexible units were adapting. Improvised defenses were slowing enemies more effectively than massive projects ever could. The data was there. The evidence was undeniable. And yet the rat remained fascinating. Because it promised something numbers could not. It promised certainty. A single object that could not be ignored. A single object that felt permanent in a war defined by loss. But permanence in war is an illusion. The darker truth is that the rat would have failed in silence. Not dramatically. Not with a legendary last stand. It would have broken down somewhere ordinary. A field. A road. A half-finished clearing. Engines overheating. Tracks damaged. Crews waiting inside steel walls while the sky grew louder. There would be no heroic image. Only waiting. Waiting for fuel. Waiting for parts. Waiting for orders that could not change reality. Another twist. Even if the enemy never fired a shot, the rat would still die. Metal fatigues. Systems degrade. Human error multiplies under stress. A machine this complex would require perfect coordination every hour it existed. Perfection does not exist in war. The idea that technology alone could replace strategy had already failed repeatedly, but the rat represents the moment when that lesson was no longer learned. When leadership stopped adapting and started insisting. Insistence is not strength. It is fear refusing to admit itself. And fear, when armored, becomes cruelty. Because resources poured into fantasy are resources taken from survival. Fuel denied to transport. Steel denied to repair. Time denied to training. The rat would not only fail by itself, it would weaken everything around it. This is why its cancellation mattered more than its construction ever would have. Letting it go was not an engineering decision. It was a psychological one. Someone, somewhere, finally accepted that domination could not be designed into existence. That the war had moved beyond monuments. That control no longer came from size, but from coordination, adaptability, and restraint. But even then, the rat left a scar. It showed how easily intelligence can become trapped inside ambition. How quickly problem-solving can transform into spectacle. How collapse encourages extremes instead of clarity. And this pattern did not die with the war. You can see it whenever systems begin to fail. Whenever leadership feels cornered. Whenever pressure replaces patience. The response is often the same. Bigger projects. Louder promises. Grand visions meant to restore confidence instead of functionality. The rat survives because it is a mirror. It reflects what happens when power feels itself slipping. When the response is not humility, but escalation. When the imagination grows while reality shrinks. This is why the story feels heavy even now. Because it is not safely locked in the past. It repeats itself in different forms, in different places, whenever fear is given permission to design the future. The Landkreuzer never rolled across Europe. Never fired its guns. Never crushed a building. But it crushed something more subtle. The boundary between ambition and madness. In the final part, the story will not end with blame or judgment, but with a quiet understanding of why this machine still matters. Of why failure, when examined honestly, can teach more than victory ever could. By the end, the Landkreuzer P.1000 rat does not explode. It does not burn. It does not make a sound. It simply fades. That is the most unsettling part of the story. After all the obsession, all the drawings, all the hours spent believing that size could replace strategy, the idea dissolves without resistance. No final argument. No last defense. Just a quiet understanding that it cannot be allowed to exist. And silence takes its place. What remains is not steel, but a question. A question that lingers long after the war is over. How did intelligent people, surrounded by evidence of failure, continue to push something so clearly impossible? The answer is not stupidity. It is pressure. Pressure bends thinking. It narrows options. It rewards extremes. When systems collapse, moderation feels weak, patience feels dangerous, and restraint feels like surrender. In that environment, the rat felt comforting. Heavy. Certain. Absolute. It promised finality in a war that offered none. But war does not end because something is large enough. It ends because people adapt faster than destruction can follow them. The rat could not adapt. It was too fixed. Too proud. Too slow. It belonged to a version of war that no longer existed. This is the final twist. The rat failed not because it was too big, but because it was too late. By the time such a machine could even be imagined, the battlefield had already changed. Air power ruled the sky. Precision mattered more than armor. Information moved faster than steel. The future was small, fast, and flexible, everything the rat was not. So the idea was left behind, like many things that could not move forward with the world around them. Years later, historians would uncover the plans and react with disbelief. Viewers would see images and laugh. Commentators would call it absurd, impossible, ridiculous. And on the surface, they would be right. But underneath that reaction is something quieter. The rat is uncomfortable because it is familiar. It shows how easily humans reach for overwhelming force when they feel cornered. How quickly confidence is replaced with spectacle. How tempting it is to believe that one final, massive solution can erase countless smaller failures. The rat never killed anyone. And that is precisely why its story matters. Because it exposes a moment where destruction was imagined without restraint, and then, just barely, stopped. It shows that even in the darkest periods, Some ideas are abandoned before they can do harm. Not because they are evil, but because they are empty. The beaches, the fields, the roads that could never have supported it remain untouched by its weight. The crews who were never assigned to it never had to sit inside its steel corridors, waiting for engines to fail and skies to fill with bombers. Failure, in this case, was mercy. And so the story ends where it truly belongs. Not in fire. Not in victory. But in reflection. The Landkreuzer Rat stands as a monument to restraint, not power. To the moment when an idea was allowed to die before it could demand lives. When you slow down and listen closely, that may be the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the greatest disaster is not the weapon that fails. It is the one that succeeds when it never should have existed. This is another concept. This is another story. And if you truly listen to it, not just hear it, it may leave you uncomfortable. Because this time, the machine was not abandoned. It was not cancelled. It was not left on paper. This time, it was built. And that changes everything. In the years before the Second World War, Germany carried a particular fear. Not of soldiers. Not of tanks. But of walls. Thick walls. Concrete walls. Fortresses that could not be broken by ordinary weapons. The memory of the First World War still haunted military planners. Years of fighting stalled by defenses that refused to collapse. So the question was not new. How do you break something that refuses to break? At first, the answers were reasonable. Larger artillery. Better shells. Improved explosives. But slowly, quietly, those answers stopped feeling enough. And when enough no longer satisfies fear, scale begins to grow. Here comes the first twist. The idea did not begin as madness. It began as logic, taken too far. If concrete is thick, use a larger shell. If the shell is not enough, make the gun larger. If the gun is too large to move, change the battlefield. And so, somewhere in Germany, engineers began drawing something that did not fit inside normal thought. A gun so large it could not be carried. A gun so heavy it could not be mounted on a vehicle. A gun that would not move freely, but only where rails allowed it. Its name would become Schwerer Gustav. And already, the story bends. Because a weapon that can only move where tracks exist is not a weapon of war. It is a monument. The barrel alone was longer than most buildings. The shells weighed more than some tanks. Each shot required preparation, coordination, and silence. This was not rapid fire. This was ritual. Pause here. Imagine waiting for a weapon to fire, not seconds, but nearly an hour between shots. Crews adjusting angles with microscopic precision. Engineers checking metal stress. Soldiers standing far away, knowing that when it fires, the ground itself will react. And this is the next twist. The gun did not roar constantly. It spoke, slowly. Each shot was an event. A pause. A breath. A warning. Thousands of men were required just to support it. Not to fight, but to protect, maintain, transport, and prepare it. Anti-aircraft units surrounded it because it could not defend itself. Engineers laid special tracks. Security guarded it like a secret that could not be hidden. Because you cannot hide something this large. Another hook. The enemy did not need intelligence. They only needed eyes. From the air, the gun was visible. From maps, predictable. From strategy, vulnerable. It could not run. It could not relocate quickly. It could not respond to sudden change. And yet, it was deployed. Why? Because it promised certainty. Against fortresses, it worked. Concrete shattered. Structures collapsed. The sound alone was psychological warfare. But the cost was staggering. Time. Resources. Risk. Every shot announced its position. Every delay invited air attack. Modern war had already moved faster. And here is where the darkness creeps in. The gun was successful, and still a failure. Because success in isolation means nothing in a war of movement. While it fired a handful of shots, entire fronts shifted. While crews prepared shells, bombers destroyed factories. While commanders admired its power, logistics bled elsewhere. The gun demanded attention, and war punished distraction. Another pause. Think about the men operating it. Not heroes charging forward, but caretakers of something immobile. Days of waiting. Nights of tension. The constant awareness that if the enemy found the range, escape was impossible. A weapon that powerful. And completely dependent. This is the core of the tragedy. The Schwerer Gustav represented absolute force, but zero flexibility. It belonged to a world where war stood still. But the war had learned to move. And still, it remained. Used rarely. Guarded heavily. Spoken of with pride and discomfort. A reminder of what could be done, and what perhaps should not have been done. By the time the war turned decisively, the gun became a burden. Moving it was harder than firing it. Protecting it drained air defense. Keeping it fed with shells and crews weakened everything else. It did not fail loudly. It became irrelevant. And irrelevance is the quietest death a weapon can suffer. This is only the beginning of the story. Because in the next part, we will go deeper into why leaders kept believing in it, why size became obsession, and how this gun and the rat were born from the same fear, even though one was built and the other never was. The moment the gun existed in reality, something changed. On paper, it had been an idea. A concept that could still be argued with, reshaped, questioned. But once the steel was forged, once the barrel was laid across specially prepared tracks, once men stood beneath it and looked up, argument disappeared. Reality had arrived. And reality has weight. From that point onward, the weapon demanded obedience. It dictated schedules. It dictated movement. It dictated protection. Everything around it began to bend. Entire railway lines were adjusted for it. Special curves, reinforced ground, carefully measured inclines. Not because it was efficient, but because it was fragile in its own way. A single misalignment could damage it. A single mistake could crack metal that took months to forge. Here is the first uncomfortable twist. The gun was not commanding the war. The war was reorganizing itself around the gun. Thousands of soldiers were assigned not to fight, but to wait. To stand guard. To repair tracks. To load shells that took cranes to lift. To check and recheck mechanisms that could not afford failure. These men did not move forward. They stayed near the weapon, tied to it, dependent on it, like attendants around a sleeping giant. And giants do not move quickly. Every shot required time. Not just to load, but to prepare mentally. The gun could not fire casually. The pressure inside the barrel was immense. The recoil traveled through steel, through ground, through bodies standing nearby. When it fired, everyone knew. When it did not fire, everyone waited. Waiting became a way of life. Another twist. The silence between shots became more important than the shots themselves. In those long gaps, the enemy moved. Aircraft repositioned. Front lines shifted. Opportunities closed. The gun was powerful, but it was slow, and slowness in modern war is not neutral. It is dangerous. Protection around the gun grew heavier. Anti-aircraft units ringed it. Spotters watched the sky constantly. Because if bombers found it, there would be no escape. You cannot hide something that requires kilometers of rail infrastructure. You cannot camouflage a presence that reshapes the landscape. The gun knew it was exposed. And exposure creates anxiety. Crews slept knowing that discovery could mean annihilation. Not heroic annihilation, not dramatic last stands, but sudden, overwhelming destruction from above. The gun could not fight back. It relied entirely on others to survive. This is where the darkness deepens. A weapon designed to dominate became a liability that needed constant reassurance. And reassurance costs resources. Fuel diverted to generators. Ammunition stockpiled in massive quantities. Trains dedicated to moving shells instead of food, repairs, or reinforcements. Every choice made to sustain the gun weakened something else, somewhere else. Here is the quiet truth. The gun did not lose battles. It displaced priorities. Commanders began to plan operations around its availability. Targets were chosen because the gun could reach them, not because they mattered most. Strategy bent toward spectacle. When the gun fired, it felt like control had been restored, even if only briefly. That feeling was intoxicating. Because in war, feeling powerful can replace being effective. The gun shattered fortifications. Concrete cracked. Dust rose. The ground trembled. Reports described destruction in precise, technical language. And for a moment, it seemed to justify itself. But then came the cost. Every shot announced its position. Every firing sequence narrowed the window before retaliation. The weapon could not relocate quickly. Tracks took time to dismantle and rebuild. Moving it was an operation measured in days, not hours. Modern war does not wait days. Another hook. While the gun prepared, bombers prepared faster. This imbalance was fatal, not immediately, but inevitably. The gun survived not because it was invincible, but because the enemy had higher priorities. Cities. Factories. Supply hubs. The gun was dangerous, but it was also predictable. And predictability is weakness. The men around it began to understand this before anyone admitted it. They felt it in the waiting. In the tension. In the way attention shifted elsewhere. The gun still existed, still demanded care, but it was no longer shaping outcomes. It was responding to them. That is the moment a super weapon begins to die. Not when it is destroyed, but when it becomes background. The gun had been built to change war. Instead, war absorbed it and moved on. And here is the most unsettling realization of this part. The Schwerer Gustav and the Landkreuzer Rat were born from the same place. The same fear. The same refusal to accept limits. One reached steel. The other stayed on paper. But both belonged to a mindset that believed domination could be engineered directly, without adaptation. One failed by existing. The other failed by never existing. And both tell the same story. In the next part, the tone grows even heavier. We will slow further. We will sit with the men, the waiting, the quiet understanding that something massive has been built for a world that no longer exists, and how that realization feels when it finally settles in. Night was when the gun felt the heaviest. During the day, there was movement. Orders. Checklists. Signals passed quietly along the line. During the day, purpose could still be performed. But at night, when engines cooled and the sky stretched wide and empty, the weight of the thing settled into the ground and into the men around it. The gun did not sleep. It waited. Men slept nearby in shallow rest, never fully relaxed. The fear was not of an immediate attack, but of sudden noise. The sound that would come without warning. The distant engines. The whine growing louder. The moment when the sky decided. This is where the story becomes darkest, because this is where belief begins to erode. The weapon had been built on confidence, on certainty, on the idea that overwhelming force could restore control. But standing beside it, night after night, the men began to feel the opposite. They were protecting something that could not protect them. They were guarding a symbol that required constant reassurance. Another twist. The gun created stillness, and stillness is deadly in a moving war. While the front shifted, the gun remained. While armies adapted, the gun demanded consistency. While tactics evolved, the gun insisted on preparation, repetition, ritual. It belonged to an older rhythm, one that no longer matched the pace of destruction unfolding elsewhere. The men noticed the changes before the reports did. Supplies arrived late. Communications became irregular. Air cover grew thinner. Each delay felt small, but together they formed a pattern. The pattern of something being quietly deprioritized. Here is the quiet horror. No one announced that the gun mattered less. It was simply treated that way. Orders came slower. Attention drifted. The silence between firings stretched longer, not because of calculation, but because of uncertainty. Targets were chosen less carefully. Purpose became vague. A weapon that once demanded focus now competed for it. And competition is something a stationary giant cannot win. Inside the crews, morale did not collapse, it thinned. Conversations became shorter. Jokes faded. Men stopped arguing about effectiveness and started discussing timing. Not when to fire, but when to move. Not if they would be attacked, but how. How fast could they scatter if the order came? How much warning would they have? Where would they run? These are not questions of confidence. They are questions of survival. Another hook. The gun had been designed to break concrete. But it was concrete that trapped it. Rails. Foundations. Platforms. Reinforcements. All necessary. All immobile. All making retreat slower than threat. The more effort spent stabilizing it, the harder it became to abandon it. And abandonment was the one thing no one wanted to consider. Because to abandon it would mean admitting what it had become. A burden. The sound of a single shot still carried power. The earth responded. Distant structures shattered. Observers recorded results. On paper, the gun continued to justify itself. But paper does not hear the sky. Paper does not feel waiting. Another layer settles in here. The men around the gun were not fighting an enemy they could see. They were fighting time. Every hour that passed without movement increased risk. Every delay narrowed options. Every night made the same calculation repeat. If we stay, we are exposed. If we move, we are slow. If we abandon it, everything this represents collapses. This is the moment when obsession reveals its cost. The gun had been built to simplify war, to reduce complexity to raw force. Instead, it multiplied complexity. It tied men, materials, and decisions into a single immovable knot. Untangling it would take time they no longer had. And so they waited. Waiting became discipline. Discipline became routine. Routine became numbness. This is the true failure of superweapons. Not that they are destroyed, but that they consume attention until nothing else can breathe. Somewhere far away, smaller units adapted and survived. Quieter weapons moved and hid. Flexible tactics saved lives. But near the gun, none of that mattered. Everything revolved around its presence. It dominated not the battlefield, but the mind. And then, slowly, almost gently, the realization arrived. The war had passed it by. No announcement marked this moment. No dramatic order. Just the understanding that even if it fired again, it would not change what was already happening elsewhere. It could still destroy. But it could no longer decide. That understanding is heavier than defeat. Because defeat can be fought. Irrelevance cannot. The Schwerer Gustav still stood. Still massive. Still capable. But now it felt like an echo from another war, standing in the wrong time, waiting for a purpose that would not return. In the next part, the story will move toward its quiet end, not with destruction, but with dismantling, dispersal, and the strange calm that follows when an obsession finally loosens its grip. The end did not come suddenly. It did not arrive with orders shouted or alarms ringing. It arrived the way exhaustion arrives, quietly, unevenly, and without drama. At first, nothing visibly changed. The gun was still there. The rails were still reinforced. Guards still took their positions. Engineers still performed inspections. On the surface, the ritual continued. But underneath, something had shifted. The urgency was gone. The belief that this machine could still shape events had thinned to almost nothing. And when belief fades, machines lose their meaning. This is where the story grows heavier, because this phase is not about failure in action, but failure in purpose. The Schwerer Gustav still worked. It could still fire. It could still destroy whatever it was aimed at. But no one was asking it to do so anymore. Targets became scarce. Orders became vague. Timelines became uncertain. The war had moved faster than the gun could follow. Another quiet twist. The gun did not need to be destroyed by the enemy. It needed to be dismantled by its own side. That decision is never easy. Dismantling something like this is not simply reversing construction. It is an admission. An acknowledgement that all the effort, time, resources, and lives tied to it no longer serve a purpose. Every bolt removed carries that weight. Every section lifted away feels like erasing a belief that once felt unshakable. The crews sensed it before it was said. Tasks changed. Maintenance slowed. Preparation was replaced by waiting for instructions that never fully arrived. Waiting again, but different this time. This waiting was not tense. It was hollow. Men began to understand that the gun was becoming an obstacle instead of an asset. Moving it required resources no longer available. Protecting it required air cover that no longer existed. Leaving it intact meant risking capture or destruction without benefit. So the only option left was subtraction. Piece by piece. Rails were removed. Sections were separated. Components that once symbolized dominance were now treated like cargo, something to be moved, hidden, or destroyed before it fell into the wrong hands. The process was slow, careful, and strangely quiet. No celebration. No relief. Just resignation. Another hook settles here. The most powerful moment is not when the gun fires its last shot. It is when it does not fire at all, and no one asks why. That silence speaks louder than any explosion. For the men involved, this stage was psychologically heavy. They had lived beside this machine. They had organized their lives around it. Its presence had defined their duties, their routines, their sense of importance. And now it was being reduced to parts, stripped of identity. A monument becoming material. And with that reduction came an unsettling clarity. The gun had never been about winning the war. It had been about postponing the feeling of losing it. Once that truth settled in, the obsession lost its grip. The machine did not betray them. Reality did. Another layer of darkness emerges here. While the gun was being dismantled, the war elsewhere was collapsing rapidly. Cities fell. Supply lines broke. Command structures fragmented. The enormous focus once given to the gun now seemed absurd in hindsight, not because it was foolish, but because it was misplaced. So much attention spent on something that could not adapt. And adaptation was everything now. The gun, once guarded like a crown jewel, became a liability that needed to disappear. Parts were hidden. Some destroyed. Some captured. The great presence that once reshaped landscapes was now trying to erase its own footprints. Even its name began to fade from conversation. This is how superweapons truly end. Not with destruction, but with dispersal. Not with defeat, but with quiet abandonment. The Schwerer Gustav did not fall in battle. It dissolved into irrelevance. And in that dissolution, something important happened. The people involved were forced to confront the difference between power and usefulness, between scale and impact, between what feels decisive and what actually is. It was a lesson learned too late to change the war, but not too late to matter. Because history remembers this stage more clearly than the firing. It remembers the waiting, the immobility, the silence. It remembers that the largest gun ever built could not keep up with a war that no longer stood still. In the final part, the story will step back and breathe. We will look at what remains after obsession fades, not steel, but meaning. And why stories like this continue to matter long after the machines themselves are gone. When it was finally gone, the absence felt larger than its presence ever had. There was no single moment when the Schwerer Gustav stopped being important. No last order. No final inspection. No ceremony. Instead, one day, men simply stopped orienting themselves around it. They stopped waking with it in mind. They stopped measuring time by its firing schedule. The war had moved on, and the gun had been left behind, standing still in a world that no longer waited. This is the quietest ending a superweapon can have. Not destruction. Not defeat. But indifference. And indifference is brutal. After the gun was dismantled, scattered, hidden, or destroyed, the spaces it once occupied felt strangely empty. The reinforced ground remained. The altered rail lines remained. The scars in the earth remained. But the purpose that had justified them was gone. The landscape looked like it had been prepared for something that never arrived. Which, in a way, it hadn't. Because the future of war had already passed that place. Here is the final twist. The Schwerer Gustav did exactly what it was designed to do, and still failed. It broke concrete. It shook the ground. It terrified those who heard it fire. But it did not change outcomes. And in war, outcomes are the only thing that lasts. Everything else becomes memory. The men who had once guarded it, maintained it, lived beside it, carried something quieter with them afterward. Not pride. Not shame. But a strange awareness. The awareness that they had served something enormous that ultimately did not need to exist. That realization lingers longer than fear. Because it forces a question that does not fade with time. Why do humans keep building things like this? Again and again, across history, when power begins to slip, scale increases. Weapons grow larger. Projects become grander. Solutions become more dramatic. Not because they work better, but because they feel decisive. Because they create the illusion of control when control is already gone. The Schwerer Gustav was not an accident. It was a symptom. It belonged to the same family of ideas as the Landkreuzer Rat. Different form. Same thinking. The belief that domination could be restored through magnitude alone. That if something was large enough, heavy enough, loud enough, it could silence doubt. But doubt cannot be silenced by steel. Only postponed. And postponement is expensive. The true failure here is not engineering. The gun was a marvel of engineering. The failure was imagination trapped inside fear. Imagination that could only move in one direction. Bigger, heavier, slower, while the world accelerated past it. When the war ended, the gun did not leave behind a legacy of victories. It left behind a lesson. One that feels uncomfortable precisely because it applies far beyond war. When systems feel threatened, they often respond by becoming rigid instead of flexible. Monumental instead of adaptable. Loud instead of responsive. And those systems, like the Schwerer Gustav, may still function, but they no longer decide anything. They become background noise. And then, eventually, they become silence. Today, the gun exists only in photographs, fragments, and stories told late at night. Stories spoken slowly, carefully. Because there is something unsettling about realizing how close belief can come to outweighing reality. The Schwerer Gustav does not ask to be admired. It asks to be understood. Not as a monster. Not as a joke. But as a warning. A reminder that power without movement becomes weight. That certainty without adaptation becomes blindness. That the largest creations often reveal the smallest margins of thought. And when you sit with this story long enough, when you let it stretch and breathe the way a 4-hour night documentary does, something becomes clear. The most dangerous weapons are not the ones that explode. They are the ones that convince everyone to stop moving while the world keeps changing. And that is why this story stays. Long after the gun is gone,